Well, let's talk to Kathryn Porter, who's an independent energy analyst. We've spoken to her a couple of times recently. Very sensible woman, much more sensible than Ed Miliband, it has to be said. Kathryn, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
We watched Ed Miliband a little bit earlier on. Let's watch him again. He now apparently thinks that he's going to collaborate with China to solve the climate crisis. Let's have a look.
In the absence of the US, if China takes on a more prominent role, what scope is there for constructive UK collaboration with China to achieve good climate outcomes for the UK?
I suppose the truth about this on China is there is no solution to the climate crisis without China, because they represent such a huge level of global emissions now. And this is a point my US friends, Democrats and Republicans make. And so, of course, part of what we have to do as a UK government is work with China, among many other countries, to drive forward climate ambition.
Yes, so we're going to work with China now to drive forward climate ambitions. How's the old national grid going? Because I always like to check in with you on that, Kathryn, because it's been pretty nasty. The storms have been blowing, the winds have been howling. Presumably gas has been on the upper edge of it.
It has, and what's interesting during the storms is that because wind turbines can't cope with wind speeds above about 45 miles an hour, they start to cut out. And so we've had days in the last week where the cut-off risk from wind has been about equivalent to a quarter of demand.
Right.
And if you could imagine that disappearing off the system in one go, the system wouldn't be able to cope. So the NESO has been having to actually shut down some wind farms deliberately, even when they weren't close to shutting off themselves, and running gas instead. And then also running gas in something that we call spinning reserve, which is basically running the gas power station and doing everything except actually generating electricity, so that if it's needed, it can synchronize to the grid really quickly, so it doesn't have to go through its ramping phase, which is normally 25 minutes.
Right.
But that's obviously a very expensive way of holding something in reserve. But it was necessary because these high wind speeds can literally cause these turbines to disappear from the grid instantaneously, and with the resulting loss of generation.
Absolutely. I mean, when I listen to you and when I look at the grid, as I do from time to time, people send me, the makeup of that day's energy quite a lot on social media. I can't really envisage a time when we don't have gas, because it's so important and it seems to be so well used and regularly used that I can't imagine it being replaced at all.
No, me neither, for that matter. I think that if we really reinvigorated our nuclear programme, then we could get to a point where we more or less removed gas from the grid and replaced it with nuclear, much in the way that France is dominated by nuclear.
Yeah.
But this is a question for, the coming decades rather than the coming years.
Right. Well, I suppose on the one hand, it's good to see Ed Miliband at least recognising that China's emissions are quite large and, in fact, are not in any way, shape or form comparable to what we put out on a given year. But what do you make of his suggestions of working sort of hand in glove, if you like, with the Chinese?
Well, I mean, he's not hardly going to say otherwise. But the reality is that China is still building lots of coal power stations. Its environmental standards are very much lower than everybody else's across the board. China's the only country that produces rare earth metals at scale, and the reason for that is that this is such an environmentally toxic process. It's the only country on Earth willing to pollute its own landscape to the degree that's necessary to do it.
Right.
And these are important components in wind turbines, ironically. So this is not likely to go anywhere. And what was interesting, I listened to that select committee yesterday. It's an hour and 45 minutes of my life I'm not getting back.
Goodness me, that is dedicated.
Yeah. Every time he was asked a question that was remotely difficult or pertinent, he just said, yeah, that's going to be really hard, without any real solutions to those challenges. He seems continually under the misapprehension that because we moved from coal to gas in the power sector, which had nothing whatsoever to do with climate goals, we were running out of coal at the same time that we discovered North Sea gas, which is why we made this switch. It was entirely incidental. But he thinks that because we happened to manage to grow the economy through that phase, that decarbonising isn't inconsistent with maintaining economic growth. All the evidence from countries around the world suggests the opposite. When you decarbonise, you harm economic economic growth.
Yeah, well, that would seem to be the case even inside of the Labour Party itself and the Labour government, because Rachel Reeves now wants to do a third runway at Heathrow. It looks as though she might get Keir Starmer's backing. It looks as though Ed Miliband is becoming more and more isolated politically. I know this is not necessarily your sort of focus on what it is that he's doing. But the government have clearly worked out what you've just said, which is that you can't, the two things are incompatible. They've made this mealy-mouthed suggestion that if they do get a third runway at Heathrow, they're going to somehow use cleaner fuel, even though they're not actually committing to manufacturing cleaner fuel up in Grangemouth, where they're actually just shutting the place down.
No, exactly. And he was asked questions about offshoring, and he went, yeah, that's kind of a bad thing, without any real solutions to it. I think, though, he's going to find himself with a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card here, because he was pretty insistent that any runway expansions would have to be compatible with the frameworks under the carbon budget.
Yeah.
I've seen some stuff recently that suggests that a third runway at Heathrow could actually cut emissions, because you'd be able to fly directly to destinations in Asia where currently you can't fly directly, and those direct flights would actually have lower emissions than the connecting flights that have to happen now.
Yeah.
So I think you might find that he does some jiggery-pokery to actually somehow determine that this is all consistent with the carbon budgets, and nobody's being hypocritical.
Yeah, but unfortunately, the rest of us who live in the real world know that that's complete and utter bunkum. And you can maybe bamboozle a committee or a cabinet meeting with that sort of rubbish, but you can't actually tell it to ordinary people with brains. It's like when Rachel Reeves said, the planes won't be flying round and round in London above the city, so the air will be cleaner. As soon as I spoke to somebody like Simon Calder, who knows about the airline industry, he says, well, if you expand Heathrow, the airlines will just fly more planes in and out, which will mean there will still be just as much congestion as there ever was. There'll just be more of it.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's why I was saying it's smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
But I suspect that will be his kind of get-out-of-jail-free card.
Yeah, well, it's not working for me. I don't think he's going to be here in a year's time, but there we are. Kathryn, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Kathryn Porter, independent energy analyst, talks an awful lot of sense, does Kathryn. Very glad that we discovered her just a few weeks ago.